Hello and welcome to another edition of Conservative Corner. I am your host, Tom Mountain, and we're very glad to have you with us as always. We're in election season. The election is upon us. Before you know it, it will be here, November 5th. If you haven't already voted, sent in your mail-in voting, voted absentee, however you want to describe it, early voting, then please remember November 5th is the day. In a perfect world, we would have everyone vote on November 5th. But that's when we were children, and we don't have that, although it is an option and should be the day where we vote. There's a myriad of ways to vote. But nevertheless, you have to vote. Please show up to the polls. And given that this is an election season, everyone seems to be preoccupied with the presidential election. And to a point, we should be. However, there are other elections which are going on. There are statewide elections. We have a very tough race with the senatorial race. Our candidate, our Republican candidate, John Deaton, whom we hosted at the Newton Harvest Fair, and he was very graciously received. So many people came up to him. He's running against Elizabeth Warren for senator. And we also have state representative and state senate races. And every 2 years, certainly the state representatives are up for re-election, just like congresspeople, I should say, in this politically correct world. So state representatives serve a 2-year tenure, and then we have to elect them, re-elect them, call it what you will. Now, you may have noticed for the past few decades, Newton has been monopolized by one party. We have become a one-party city, and I believe in this city we have 36 potential elected positions, 24 for city council, 8 for school committee, 1 for mayor, and 2 for state rep and 1 for state senator. And that's a lot of positions to be controlled by one party. We are a one-party city. Now, they say, long prior to my arrival here in the 1950s and 60s, that Newton was also a one-party city run by the Republicans. Now the pendulum has swung the other way. But as you can well imagine, and as I'm sure you'll concur, it's never good when one party dominates the entire spectrum of city politics or state politics or national politics, but especially in city politics, because really, folks, what matters to all of us is what happens on a city level, what happens in our neighborhoods, what happens in our schools, what happens specifically in the community that we chose to live in and pay property taxes to and to send our children to school. So I am very glad, very happy to announce, or rather to re-announce, since he's very, very well known in this district by now, that he is a state committee, a state representative candidate who is running against, or rather for, the open seat left by Kay Khan. Now, Kay Khan served this community for several decades, let's say anywhere from 2 to 3 decades. It's a very long time. But she is retiring, and there is an open race for her seat. And there are 2 candidates. There is my dear friend whom I'm going to announce, and there's another candidate. You have a Democrat and a Republican candidate. Now, if you think of it, do we really need another Democrat in office? No, we don't. We need some political diversity, as the liberals like to say. Diversity, they love that word, don't they? Well, diversity is sitting across from me. And he is a candidate for state representative. And he is as I said, my newfound friend, Steve Yanovsky, who lives on Center Street. Steve, thank you so much for being here. I really
Tom.
appreciate
It's a pleasure.
you being here. And, and I want to add on a personal note that Steve and I were actually competed against each other for a state committee and state committee man. It's an internal contest in our Republican Party, as it is also in the Democrat Party. So presumably only Republicans and independents could vote. And so Steve ran against me as the incumbent. I'm the incumbent state committee man. I have been in that position since 2017. And I didn't know Steve prior to that. But what I noticed about him was that he ran a very professional, clean race. And by that I mean these things can get pretty nasty, especially within the party. I've seen it happen. They can get pretty nasty.
Sure.
But Steve chose the higher ground. He was a perfect gentleman, very congenial, very friendly, and I was grateful to him for that. And I grew after that to know him and to like him to the point where I was very glad when he agreed to run for state rep for this open seat. And through that, I am and have become an enthusiastic supporter of Vlad, I should say. Steve is your Americanized name.
Correct.
Vlad acquiring or winning this seat for state rep in Newton, because for two reasons. Number one, as I said, we need political diversity. Number two, Steve is extremely qualified and very competent to hold this position. And above all, his character is above reproach. And that's very important in politics today. It really is. And I appreciate that about him. And what I found and I saw this recently at the Harvest Fair, is that the more people who meet him, and I don't mean to make you blush, but the more people who meet him, the more people that like him, because he's a very personable, sincere fellow. And he has a very interesting story as well. Now, Vlad, tell me, you came to America from the former Soviet Union at what age?
I turned 13 as soon as we landed in the United States, so 13.
Okay, so you came here, and what decade was that, the 80s?
In the 80s, we came here in 1981. Yeah.
Okay, so you came really when the Soviet Union was still very hardcore.
In full swing.
And were your family what was called refuseniks?
You know, yes and no. It's an interesting thing. Refuseniks were people who were refused exit from the Soviet Union. We were people who didn't receive either a yes or a no, and we waited for approximately 5 years in complete and total limbo.
I mentioned that because during the early 80s, when I was a student at Brandeis, I was very much involved with the Student Coalition for Soviet Jewry, and we tried our best to help Jews get out of the Soviet Union. And many of them did not. It was only after the fall of communism that they left en masse.
Yes.
And so you got here early on, at the age of 13. And where did you go to high school?
I went to Brookline High School.
You went to Brookline High?
Went to
Brookline. Came to Brookline first?
That's right. We came to Brookline first. I ended up staying there for 4 years.
And then afterwards, you did something very interesting. You joined the American Army.
Yes.
And you were there for 8 years.
8 years together with the active duty and reserves. Yeah, altogether 8 years.
And you became, and your rank before you discharged was?
I just made it to a sergeant.
Sergeant?
Yes, was planning to make it a career and go to officer candidate school, but then life.
So you came from a totalitarian society, a country, which was the former Soviet Union. You went to high school here, and then you joined the U.S. Army.
Yes.
And you stayed there, not for the typical 4-year stint. You stayed there for 8 years. Now, why did you join the Army, and why did you stay for 8 years?
It was out of sense of gratitude for the welcome that my family received that I stayed, that I decided to join the military. I also wanted to, how should I say, go for a personal re-education campaign. I figured who would do that better than the military, and I went in for that.
That's wonderful. Your story is I've heard it before, foremost of which from my old dear friend, now departed Steve Ross, who was a victim in the Holocaust, and when he came to America, he joined the American Army as well and served a stint there. So I thank you for your service and congratulate you for that. And I mean that because far too often we don't. I think that we really don't appreciate military veterans enough. And as an active member of the American Legion, I know the ladies in the control room do our best to do that. So Veterans Day is coming up soon, and I don't know if this will still be on during Veterans Day, but at a minimum, I wish you a happy Veterans Day and good for you. So to the matter specifically, you've lived in Newton for how many years?
Well, my family moved to Newton in the early 80s. Even though I stayed in Brookline High School, my mother had, we stayed there. But my parents have, and we've been living in Newton since 84, I would say.
And you live on Center Street across from BC, and your house is very easy to find, not because of your campaign signs,
right,
but because, and I've noticed this, your house is one of the few homes that have a big American flag out front.
That is true.
And you have 5 children. You're married with 5 children.
That is correct.
And they range from adults to younger children.
I have only one young child left. He's 14. The rest are all adults and getting even more adult here.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so tell me, you're running for state rep, and you're running for someone who's very, I know her and I like her.
Yes,
she's
I
a
do
nice
too.
person.
Wonderful.
But she's very left-wing, almost borderline socialist. She's in the, quote, progressive camp. And you came from a country where that was more pronounced, shall we say?
Yes.
But I think that you've seen this before.
Yes.
Maybe not to such a, and I don't want to be unfair to your opponent, but it's still the progressive socialist mindset. So tell me, so tell me specifically, you're running, and why do you want to be state rep?
I'd like to see a return to the original values, which were basically, this is the cradle of liberty. We're in Massachusetts, where all of these ideas took root and led into the American Revolution, which is opposite from all revolutions which end up in bloodshed and despair. This led to unbridled prosperity over several hundred years, which was an amazing institution, which was, the foundation was laid here. But we have strayed away from that foundation. We've strayed away from the rugged individualism and individual freedoms, and we're moving towards this nanny state, which will ultimately prevail over individual rights and freedoms, and will end up like every other socialist experiment that we ever ran, which leads to strife, financial deprivation, food shortages, and the like, and of course loss of life, which we've seen across the globe. The earth is hydrated with the blood of innocents, and that's where all of these wonderful socialist ideas lead to. And I mean wonderful, quotation marks here, that there's nothing wonderful here. They don't work. They go contrary to the human nature. As conservatives, we understand that there is the body and there's the soul, and it's a union of the two. It's not just about throwing money at a problem. It's also about nurturing the soul and allowing people to do good things, but on their own accord.
Now also, you've been, and I've watched some of your forums around town, you've been barraged with the typical liberal mantra about what would you do to make Newton a more green city, what would you do about climate change, what would you do about affordable housing, all this common mantra. So I want to ask you, and I'm not going to ask you about those questions, because since you've been bombarded with them and you've handled them well, but I want to ask you some basic questions that are of concern to people.
Sure.
How do you feel about, and this is pertaining to the Newton schools, and how do you feel about boys participating in girls' sports?
I think it's unfair to the girls, and it shouldn't be. Girls are girls, boys are boys, and sports need to be kept separate.
How do you feel about, so with that being said, how do you feel about boys being allowed into girls' bathrooms and girls' locker rooms in the public schools?
Well, I'm a father of girls and boys, of course, and as a father and a grandfather now at this point in time, there's something intrinsically wrong with all of this. We have millennia worth of information on how the sexes need to behave. We are separated for a reason. It needs to stay that way. I think it's a bit inappropriate, to say the least.
How do you feel about the schools, shall we say, encouraging, if not supervising, so-called gender change among children under the age of 18?
Mm-hmm.
Supporting them.
It's an interesting thing that I've had this conversation with several young women at the Harvest Fair the other day. They were very concerned about all of this. Why exactly, I don't know. They were of concern, but we had this deep and long conversation, which at some point in time they really didn't quite understand what was coming out of my mouth, but I tried to explain it to them. So I explained to them that schools have no business taking care of this information. It's between children, it's between their healthcare provider, and of course, most importantly, their parents. It's about issues of consent. When minors don't have a right to consent, informed consent, that is. There's uninformed consent. If somebody's unconscious and they need medical care, then life-saving care needs to be administered. But when we talk about life-changing, quote-unquote, care, that is the responsibility of the parent and the child, and then the state steps in the form of a school, which fosters this, dare I say, delusional behavior. But we can, scratch delusional. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that this is behavior that's treatable, diagnosable, and so on and so forth. But they want to do this without the involvement of parents. See, this is where we have to draw the line. See, if we're talking about science, this and the other thing, let's say that they're right, but it's the parents who bear ultimate responsibility for their children, and we're taking that away from the parents.
How do you feel about the schools teaching human sexuality and about different lifestyles to children as young as preschool.
I oppose that completely and totally.
Now, the reason why I'm mentioning these things to you is that recently the State Board of Education and decided to, well, they enacted all of the above and more. And the school committee enthusiastically embraced that and more in Newton to basically to impose on the school system, the students and the parents alike. And I actually I contacted one school committee member and basically told her that this is totally out of sync with the majority of Americans. They find this to be repulsive and extremely inappropriate. And while it may sell to a certain extent in Newton, it doesn't elsewhere. So, the interesting thing is that what happens in Newton does, like those things that we just talked about, do not tend to happen elsewhere in the country. So Newton is really unique in that sense. And so my contention is that the extremists of them, not the rest of us who are in the mainstream, who object to this and who don't understand why they're trying to push these agendas. And it's not just in Newton. It comes from the state, and also from I believe it's called Title IX from the Biden administration. Which, by the way, all of this, at least from the national level, if the election turns a different way and the Democrats do not win, this will be watered down, if not disappearing, to a great extent. This whole DEI mindset, this whole DEI ideology, which is entrenched in the schools, will pretty much go by the wayside.
I think this is all an extension of a socialist mindset where the folks in that particular camp believe that it's the experts that need to run the show. And that permeates the school body in general.
Yes.
So they believe that some expert on top will decide and make the determination what's good for the kids, when in fact it's the parents who know best. Once going back to the family unit where these decisions of what's good for the family, for the children, all of these decisions need to be made over there. We don't really need those experts, to decide what's right. There needs to be a local involvement in the school boards, greater local participation, and of course, we need competition in the school business. Okay, as a person who runs a school, again, competition is extraordinarily healthy. Competition keeps me on my toes. Competition gives me opportunity to teach my students better. And so when we have this hegemony of the public schools in Newton or any place else, then they tend to run amok because their ultimate power trumps just about anything that anyone is going to say.
And one of the things in Newton in particular that they want to try to enact is to change the zoning laws to discourage single-family homes, and to have multi-level homes and multi-level apartments near subway stations, near train stations. And this is really a part of the national agenda, which was started under the Obama administration, interrupted when Trump took over for 4 years, resurrected in the Biden administration. So it all gets back to that they want to eliminate cars. They want to eliminate combustion engines on the streets, which is why you have these bicycle paths everywhere. They're such a nuisance. They're dangerous. They're bad. I can't stand them. And so what they do is they want to, because of their whole, and it's really a part of their ideology. It goes back to this whole climate change mantra, where they're trying to force people by rezoning into these big apartment buildings as close to public transportation as possible. In other words, they want to do away with the cars.
They want renters. They don't want homeowners.
Exactly.
They want commuters and not drivers. Okay, I can understand the value of a good transportation system, but we have a bad transportation system. We have bad roads, and we have too many bicyclists on the road.
Yes, we do. And what I try to tell them, I say, for 6 months out of the year, you cannot ride a bike here. And by the way, we're not Amsterdam. It's not really a part of our culture.
That's right.
Now also, I want to ask you is, we constantly hear about this mantra of affordable housing.
Yes.
And I don't know about your kids, but I have 3 kids, and I'm lucky that one of my children was able to get back into Newton a few years ago, and now I don't think that, and I have two children who are not back into Newton, and I found that many of my children's contemporaries who graduated from the Newton schools were not able to move back into Newton because the prices are so high.
Sure.
So in terms of affordable housing, it's not affordable for them, even though many of them are professionals and they just live elsewhere. They live in Needham and Westboro, and they just move outside, shall we say, the Route 128
Sure.
Beltway. So, and then we hear the mantra of we have to have affordable housing. Well, what in the world does that mean? Does that, you tell me, and
Well,
what's your
what
position
that
on
means is that the housing for people who live here now is going to become unaffordable because somebody has to pay for all of this. And it's not just a figment of anybody's imagination. It's when you go to sell your house, as Amy wanted to introduce at that extra layer of taxation, transfer tax of
You're referring to your opponent, Amy.
Yes,
Sangiolo.
yes. She spoke about this, so I can talk freely. This is one of her ideas.
course.
She wants to introduce that transfer tax. When a person wants to sell their house, they'll pay an additional $50,000 roughly, in addition to what we already pay, to sell a home. How does that make anything affordable? Making quote-unquote affordable housing and transplanting people into Newton, making Newton look and feel like Everett or Somerville. Nothing against Everett or Somerville, but that's not Newton. See, Newton is like it's like a membership in a private country club. It's well groomed, it's well taken care of, but there is a fee associated with it. You can go play golf if you really want to at a public course, but it costs less, but it's not as well groomed and properly taken care of. Newton is a fabulous, beautiful city. Anyone can come and live here if they can afford to. It's hard to live in Newton because for the taxes we pay, for the amount of money we're spending on the school system. We're spending close to 60% of our budget on our public education. That's a lot of money. That's well over $130 million a year. It's a lot of money, especially when we have a lot of unfunded obligations, like for our infrastructure and for pensions that we owe people and for first responders and so on and so forth. And if we're beginning to transplant people who are renters, who are not attached, but they can afford to rent a two-bedroom apartment in one of these new complexes that are being built, their children are going to Newton Public School because, quote unquote, it's good. And what happens? Now we need to change our ratio in a classroom, which means we need to hire more teachers. That means we need to pay more taxes. And where even my house requires, in order for me to pay my taxes annually, someone in my household has to work at $15 an hour full-time for a year just to cover my taxes. Well, after their withholdings, of course. But that's an awful lot of money. People don't understand what people pay here in taxes. And my house is not a big house. It's a modest little home on Center Street there. There are people here in Newton who pay $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year for the privilege to live in Newton. And now we're going to burden these people even more. Well, just because they're well off does not mean that they must pay and subsidize somebody else. It is good to be charitable at your own desire, at your own pace.
Of course.
But to take people and to take away their money just because you feel that somebody else needs to live here, just because it's their right?
Let me switch gears for a minute. There's when Charlie Baker was still governor, many of my colleagues criticized him because he was a liberal Republican, and he was.
Yeah.
But in the last 2 years of his administration, which coincided with the first 2 years of the Biden administration, he purposefully and assertively kept the illegal immigrants from coming to Massachusetts. They did not come here. They didn't come here in throngs and en masse like they do now under the liberal Democrat governor Maura Healey, and they're literally everywhere, including Newton.
Yeah.
And the state is left with a tab of at least $1 billion to pay for these, and I don't call them migrants, illegal immigrants.
Yes, yes.
Who have come to as far in the Northeast, and we're about as far, aside from Maine, from the Rio Grande Valley as you can get.
Yes, yes. But every state is a border state, Tom.
Exactly.
You know that.
But the point is that they were in Newton. I've been told, and I've asked around that we do have some motels and hotels, and they're not in there yet because, they're not going to be at I believe it's the Crown Plaza above the Turnpike. That's a very high-end hotel, and we have a few other motels that they may or may not be in. But they did sneak in, and they were in they were in a certain church on the north side of town.
Yeah.
And they were put in there and on their grounds of this independent Catholic church. And from what I understand, that the Catholic Charities subsidized that church, and they in turn got their money from the federal government. So they were acting as a subcontractor for the federal government. So my point being is that the illegals, they're coming in masse, and there's tens of thousands of them within this state. There's a lot of them within the state.
Correct. About 50,000 now.
For those of us, you and I, at a ripe middle age that is still working, we are expected to subsidize them with our state taxes. And what's interesting is that when the governor, after realizing that she's running out of place to put them, she put out a holler, I call a call, to the public to please take them in. Well, guess what? I don't think any state legislatures, Democrats in particular, agreed to take them in. So, but we're being overrun by them. What is your position on that? What do you think of all this?
You know, I'm going to be a little bit philosophical and say it this way. When you are kind to the cruel, you'll be cruel to the kind. We have so many people who need our help right here in a Commonwealth, mentally ill, homeless because they are mentally ill, or people, women of color who need shelter, for example. I've not just women of color, any women, for example, who are going through Rosie's place, at a place like this, they need, and we have to provide, you know, for these people. They're our people. We need to give them all the support if they're in trouble. As a society, we owe them that. Now, Rosie's place, for example, receives tremendous amount of support from private donors, just like many other shelters do too. People give and give and give again. It's a worthwhile cause. I had a woman working for me. She had a fire in her home and was displaced. Would you believe that we couldn't find her a motel to stay in? Red Cross couldn't find her a motel because the illegal had occupied, and this was a woman of color, Hispanic woman.
You know, and this is a woman who's a citizen, probably American born as well.
Absolutely.
And this is what we're dealing with, Vlad, and this has to stop. Now, I believe if the new administration comes in, this will stop. And hopefully, you will be on the state legislature and really lead the charge in the state legislature. And I also want to elaborate or specify that currently there's 160 individuals in the state legislature, and only 25 are Republican. That's not a lot. We need a lot more. We only have 4 Republican state senators. Just like in Newton, we need political diversity.
DEI. I'm the DEI candidate.
We
it's
need
me.
the political diversity on and the State House, and we need you to win, and we need all of the people in the on the what do I call it, the left side of town, so to speak, mostly on the left side, the north side, going towards Waltham in that area, Weston, to vote for you, west of Commonwealth Avenue, and they need to come out, and I think they will come out because you will be out there and speaking to the public, and I wish you success, and we're going to be out there gunning for you or
Thank you, Tom.
supporting you.
Thank you so much.
It's the fastest 30 minutes in Newton Talk TV, and we appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much.
And I wish we could have done an hour, but unfortunately we can't. Good luck to you, and
Thank
we'll
you
be
very
there
much.
for you.
Thank you.